アウトシンドロームズ。
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us, me today. I'm going to be doing a panel on world building. First, before all the introductions and whatnot, I try to be very interactive with people. If you have questions, throw them in the Discord chats. My moderator will ask them. I will get them to me, and I'll get them answered. And since there's a slight delay, I figured throw that up there right away. I want to know from you, like, what kind of writing are you doing? Are you writing for games? Are you writing for, for your role playing groups, books, comics? Knowing this lets me know kind of how to attack the world building from that. So, yeah, if you've got questions and it is about a specific style of writing, throw that in there so that I have a better understanding of that. So, about me. I'm Will Carson. I write a fair amount, and I also direct a number of projects. So I focus a lot on world building. I care, like, when we produce role playing games, like, I want the system. The system's important, but to me, the world that we provide is the setting. And a lot of new role players, or not people who are getting into new role playing games, are buying it a lot for the settings, and so that's important to me. In my novels, it's like I very much build out the world and alter the worlds as works for what I'm writing. But I also have, like, a big project that I'm directing, that we've built the whole world from the ground up, and, like, a whole bunch of things work differently, and we've had to, in the world building, in order to make it believable, like, we have to follow a lot of the all of the things that get caused by things like there's a no day or night cycle in one of our worlds, and the build out that you have to deal with for something like that, because it changes the linguistics. We don't realize how much our speech just has to do with day or night or tomorrow and stuff like that. So yeah, just depending on what I'm doing. Where if I'm writing a short story, maybe my world is just a room, right? Like, maybe I don't need to world build all that much.
Yeah, it looks like the chat is saying that they're doing a fantasy novel. I think it's supposed to be a comical with a bunch of hidden messages and tributes to Shakespeare. And we have another one about trying to describe the world of Pokemon from a practical standpoint. So it looks like novels, fantasy, fanfic, that kind of stuff is what people are looking for.
Oh, that's great. Like, and it's for things like the Pokemon, from you said Pokemon in.
Yeah, sort of Pokemon from a practical standpoint of, like, how does it, like, how do you describe that? Like, how do you try to write a realistic fantasy novel where, where your pocket monsters are real and it's not like the insanity that is the show sometimes?
Yeah, and things like that. What I like to do is, one of the things that I tell in all of my world building panels that I do is I always like to take whatever world I'm dealing with, whether it is our current world, and then adding whatever it is. Like, this is the pocket monsters that are real, and how to deal with that. And I always say follow the spider web. Like, if you've got pocket monsters that are real, in our world, if you pulled out some sort of weird monster from your pocket, a lot of people may lose their shit. Other people are going to be fascinated. But if it's just part of our everyday life, how do those responses change, and then how does that affect stuff? And then things like, if this is the thing that people have all of these monsters, there's going to be industry around it. And a lot of culture is built around the sports we do, the industries that have come up to deal with whatever is driving our economy. And so, like, for something like that is where you're looking at what are the effects in the world building, is setting both what is natural and unnatural in your world, and then how that changes the perspective of everyone else in the everyday, and and also just normalizing things. There are a lot of things that I don't explain in a world because the characters talk about it like it's fully normal, and eventually the reader just feels like they're part of that.
So there's a question from chat from Jellybean93. So they're working on a novel and they're asking, would you suggest to have the world environment figured out first, or do you just start writing the story and you get to a point and you're like, oh yeah, I need to retcon that into the rest of my story? Like how do you approach that?
I hit that from both sides. So like in our Ages of the Elements, the big project that we're working on, we very much had to build the world first, and so we built the world, and then we started writing, and then our writing also influenced the world, and you kind of play them back and forth off of each other. But like when I was working on when I'm working on my novel series, I very much just started writing. I was like, I'm starting with Earth, and things are different. And then as I got to them, like for me, like rules are important. I find that a lot of the things that I build on the back end of my worlds, uh, people will never read. Like it's not actually meant for them. I end up uh, if I do something and it's not normal, I have to figure out why in my world setup that's a thing, and I'll write that down on the back end and I'll make that a rule so that even if I don't ever explain it to the reader, these rules start to bleed through. So it really does depend on what the focus of what you're writing is. If you're not, or if you're writing a novel that takes place on a mysterious planet, but also don't let yourself get so caught up in building the world that you never write. I find that is a trap that people fall into. You feel the need to nitpick and micromanage, and I think that I always feel like if you can get in broad strokes what your world is, and then you start writing, and then and it's like then you get in a predicament and you're like, how would I get out of that? And based off of the rules you already have, you're like, oh, I think I could do this. But in doing that, you've now set a new rule for your world, and and making sure that then you put that over in your world building area, and so that way you always follow that. Because one of my pet peeves is when when someone has done something in a story and it's basically feels like it's set a precedent, and then later on that precedent gets completely disregarded, and that can happen because of either lazy writing or just you forget. Like I track so much stuff in my writing, and and I go back and I retcon a lot of stuff as needed, but once it's published you can't.
So you talked a lot about tracking things. How do you actually do that? Because like I think of so many things and you write it in chapter 7 and then you're like, oh shoot, I got to remember that in chapter 12 that I did that.
I take a lot of notes. I will regularly, and it might be something stupid, right? Like I had in my second book, I was writing it. Someone gets, someone is getting introduced to a household, and they tell the kid, "Hey," and I was like, "All of your food needs are taken care of. You could even order, you could even use the intercom and order pizza if you wanted." And I wrote that note down. Like I haven't called back to that. I haven't run a scene where he frivolously orders a pizza using the intercoms in the house. But like I wrote that down as just like a little note that I could call back to. And then when I'm trying to think about stuff, I will look back through those. One of the things that I've just started using like a couple of weeks ago is there's a program called Campfire, and it does a really good job of tracking all of your character interactions and whatnot, which you can do with hyperlinks and Word documents and spreadsheets and all that stuff, which is what I've done for 15 years. But I'm really liking this other bit because then I can actually very easily see every link between characters. I can see every link between scenes, who all was in the scene, and who all's been to what locations and who's had effects on things. So that's one of the new ones that I'm playing around with right now, and I'm sure that there's lots of other softwares. But for me, like when I was just writing short stories, I didn't feel a need to track that much stuff. When I was just working on the first and even second book, I didn't feel like it was too much. But now that I'm working on the third book in the series, where there's a lot of crossover in timelines, I felt the need to upgrade my tracking abilities. But yeah, I use I use technology.
So with I think it was Edric Navigator in the chat. Looks like they're a DM who spends just tons of time filling notebooks with this epic backstory, but then like they don't have any plans for a session, so they're struggling with that. So like, how do they know when it's time to stop doing world building and then actually like buckle down and get their campaign figured out?
I feel like when you get down to the point where you've got the broad views and you know how the world works, and you've got your major, depending on what scale you're working on, as your major cities, your major buildings, or even just your major planets if you're playing on that big of a scale. But like, get the big stuff out of the way, and then decide what kind of stories you want to be telling, yeah, as a GM, and then understand that your players are going to just kick them right out the window. Uh, uh, that's a whole nother rant. But like, don't get into the weeds with your world building before you start telling your story. You want more broad strokes. One, because you don't want to corner yourself. Like, if you built too much stuff into it, and now like things are functioning and all this stuff, and or like you've got so many rules going on that there's no need for the adventuring party. But if you leave it nice and open, and then you can start dropping in, you're like, hey, what do I want? I want to introduce this villain. Okay, build out that villain a little bit, and then and see how they can get in the way of what you've already built in the world. And if there's not enough for them to get in the way of, build some things for them to get in the way of. But then start writing your story. And as a GM, I'm pretty big on, like, I don't like to railroad. I am way for giving a good world and letting them play, giving them a handful of hooks, and uh, and don't focus too much. If you've got that big bad guy and that's what you're focused on, um, you're going to find yourself kind of again pigeonholed. But if you're always just like, oh no, I've got this town built out, here's a few buildings, and then someone says, hey, I want to go down to the carpenter, and you're like, oh fuck, I didn't have a carpenter. And you're like, hey, look, there's a carpentry building. And then you make a character, and character building is I think is runs right alongside world building. But like, don't focus too much on having a fleshed out character. They may not care about the character, and two, they may love just this random little bit you threw in there. But yeah, ultimately, I think broad strokes on your world building before you start running your role playing game. And then just kind of on more of a GM note, I'm also big on having a conversation with the players that I'm going to be playing with, to see what they want, and find out what it is they want out of your world, and make sure, one, that works with what you're trying to do. But you can find those inspirations, and then you start working on their story, but then you have to start building out some of the world to make that work. And when those two come together, life is beautiful.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know in DMing, as well as when you're writing books, like, a DM, you have these sessions that happen, that there's a history, that your characters build a story. And like when you write a book, the same thing happens. You publish a book, that's lore now, and undoing it is kind of hard. So, like, where do you draw that line on where you're trying to do, where you like I'm going into world building mode, and then it's more of a, hey, I'm just having fun and telling a story mode? Like, how do you strike that balance when you're sort of working through this process that may take weeks, months, years to complete?
Yeah, I mean, I I am big on, like, it's like I've been writing my series for more than a decade, and just only started really feeling comfortable with everything matching up. Like, I have I'm on book 3 right now, and I'm only just starting doing the release process for book 1, and it's been nice because I can go back and I can, as I've fleshed out the world more or fleshed out the characters more, I can go in and still make some edits. But once they're published, they're there, right? Like you've as you've said, you've made them lore, and like my big thing on that is when I want to work on bringing either the story or the world to a next level, and I feel like I'm pigeonholed by something that I've written already. I have to get myself out of that mentality and think, okay, how can I use that lore to guide me to where I'm at? Or I'll oftentimes look back at, hey, this happened, but I also will write things both in the world building and the character interaction where like someone sees something happen and I never explain it. And then I will write that down in my notes of here's something that I can call back to, and then I can explain it from the knowledge I have at this point. And so like I like leaving a lot of those little pieces in there, and they can inspire me to write. But instead of going back and being like, oh, I have to retcon this. Oh, I have to build in this thing that kind of works against something I wrote earlier, but it helps this go. And I'm like, I feel that's lazy writing and lazy world building. Like it's world building is about, or storytelling is about solving puzzles, and the more you build out your world, the more pieces of puzzle there are that either will or will not work with each other.
Yeah, so with that puzzle solving, I like, do you have any tips on how to get yourself out of a corner? Like, I built this wonderful system and I've done all this stuff, I've published, I've had the session, and then you're like, yeah, I don't know, I'm just not feeling it. I want to go somewhere else. Like, how do you get out of that rut without, making a story where you just say, and then magic happened?
Yeah, I I am working. The series that I'm working on right now. Like I know in the end, I don't want to be anything like the series is in the beginning, and so me is like I am slowly introducing things that break stuff. Like like and I know in role playing, a lot of people will get like precious about their characters, and they don't want things broken. They don't mind if they do some breaking, but what they want is they want to tell the story. But like destruction in some way or another, I feel is a great way to heal something into the direction that you want it. Be that I feel like this entity is too powerful, and it's like, and I what I don't want is to destroy big entity with bigger entity, because that just keeps doing this, and then you have a lot of the problems that I have with some of the anime tropes of just power unlimited characters, and superheroes have the same problems, right? Where if you can go through and give more like even like social reasons, economic, natural disasters, things that are outside the realm of power of what you're dealing with currently, that forces those characters to do something different. And that can be as simple as some catastrophe happened, it ripped a rift in the universe, and now things that deal with the world very differently are coming in. How do we handle versus just, hey, time has passed, we have become enlightened, and we've fixed these problems, but underneath there's these other new problems, because that's the way of things. So yeah, there's like like really, if things are, or you feel like things are in a rut, I really do believe in break stuff.
Nice. So one of them that we had mentioned in the chat, Blackjack mentioned that she's writing a fanfic in the Pokemon universe, and in the second movie, there's this airship that is just an abomination of physics and science and everything, and it's really hard when you're trying to write a story that is incredibly realistic and sort of brought things into the world, and especially when you're writing fanfic, the source material might just been like, hey, it's anime physics, who cares? Like, how do you write a story, or how do you like jump from the fantasy that's artistic license that the animator does, and then like come in and go, hey, I want to write something that's serious.
So that can be fun. Actually, airships in general. So our very first role playing game that we were working on, my lead writer had he had these airships all figured out, and he loved them. And our like one of our new artists that we had just brought on was a technical director for Forza. What she knows is vehicles really well and how they're designed and how they work. And she was like, during our meeting, she's like, you guys go about your meeting, I'm going to do something. And like she sketched some stuff up, and she says, based off of the physics of your world and how things work, this is what your airships would look like. And and so we adopted that because she knows better than we do. But so sometimes it is you retcon it for your world, right? Like you're like, okay, that didn't work. Other times, like, and this is where I like the puzzle pieces, right? You're just like, okay, that the parts that we saw make no sense. So what's inside that makes it work? And if you've got a character who's obsessed with, how the heck does that work, right? Like this doesn't make sense. And boom, they have an adventure now, right? Like they've got a story to get in there and figure it out. Get into the dry docks, get into, get on board, do something and figure out. And maybe it turns out that what's actually in there is a bunch of slave Pokemon who have the ability to keep that thing floating through the air. And now you're stuck with this new dilemma. Are you cool with that? Or are you really not? And now your story does this.
Yeah, you've now just prompted me to think, oh yeah, we need an isekai where it's an engineer who gets transported to another world with all the crazy science, and it's like, how does that work? And that's the entire story is them like breaking into stuff to figure out how that stuff works. That'd be super cool.
Well, and
Um,
that has that advantage too of like like you're probably going to get caught. Boom, you've added new new tripping hazards. So
yeah, so with so talking about a little bit coming back to the DMing piece, uh, with those characters, you kind of mentioned that you had characters that don't follow your story, or it could even be, you bring someone in to help you write a story, and they're just like, yeah, what you've written is dumb, or we don't want to do it, and we're going to go off in our own little realm. Like how much, like both in like maybe start with the DMing of like how you handle that, and then in the more of a fantasy or in a novel writing, like if you get feedback. So why don't we start with the DM ones, and then we'll come back to
yeah.
the one.
So first, and this is a trick that I've learned way more recently than I would like to admit, but it's only been in the last few years. But like sitting down and having figuring out the social contract with your players is super important, because turns out if they don't want to be playing the game that you want to be running, you don't have the right group. And there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, maybe I'm not the GM for this group right now, or maybe we need, or maybe you need to be like, okay, I'm gonna write, or I need to go a different direction because I need to provide something that they enjoy. Like I had a group that I was with for like 5 years, and they decided they were going to go another direction. And I was like, cool, I'm going to step out of this game for a little while because it's just not what I'm interested in playing right now. But and it's like, and that can suck. Like if you built a lot, like it's like maybe you now need to go fish for the players who want what you're building. And if you're in the Seattle, Portland area, like I suspect a lot of the people in here are, there's lots of people to choose from. But yeah, and like as a GM, like I have had several times where like I had these ideas, and I used to try to railroad, but no one has fun when they're railroaded. Unless you're playing with a very specific subset of gamer who really just is along for the ride.
Yeah. So following up on that, I kind of mentioned I found a better way to uh, build that question. So like let's say you give your story to somebody else. So you write in a novel, you hand it off to someone, and then they read it, and then they give you like just like a mountain of notes about your story, about what they don't like or they do like. Like how much do you actually, or how much of that should you actually take into consideration when you do your rewrites or you do your edits?
So I get a lot of those, and there's I split my notes into two categories. I first off I will try to take the notes and it's like what is purely their that reader's taste, right? Like they if this they didn't quite like because like that's just not what they're into, versus what is things that they're mentioning that are structurally wrong or loopholes or just plot holes and stuff that they see. And so I split those into those. And also if I see someone who's given, or if I give multiple people who are given that same note, then there's probably something that needs to be addressed. But like I look at those and I'll go through all the stuff that is like the plot holes and the things that are just kind of wrong that I missed or thought about and then just never got onto the page. And I'll go take care of those first. And the stuff over here, I really then have to look at is, are the problems that they have problems that my target audience is going to have? Like if I give it to 5 readers and they all have these problems and they're all really my target audience, then maybe I need to find another way to approach that. And like but then there's other things that are meant to be uncomfortable in your world. In the first book, I had one of my test readers who read this chapter, and there's just something absolutely horrific that happens, and like she called me up and she says, "Hey, I'm not okay with this. Does anything else like this happen in the book?" And I was like, "No, this is an example. This is like this is the one thing." She's like, "Okay," and she kept reading, but like she kept coming back when we would talk to that thing, and like it was just something that morally bugged the hell out of her. And so like that one, like she was enough bothered by it that I then went to my other readers and said, "Hey, this thing, does it bother you?" And they're like, "Oh, it's uncomfortable, but like it is showing me something important in the world and in the story." And so I sometimes you have to double check these things. Like, did you take a turn a little too hard? And so like yeah, I don't let everyone's little critique uh, change everything I do. But what I do is I look at it objectively and I'm like, oh, that would help my story, and go from there.
So when specifically when writing for fantasy stories, like how important is it to come up with some sort of original gimmick in your story? Like you're on the moon, or there's everybody, all the vampires sparkle, or like those type of things where it's just sort of a thing that people remember, or like what's your thoughts on that?
So I like to add a gimmick or something, right? Like I like to do something that makes the world mine. But sometimes that's not what you're looking for. Like I know a lot of fanfic. Like what you're not trying to do is make the world yours. You're trying to be part of a world that's already there. In which case, I don't feel that there's any need for those gimmicks, right? Like there's you just want to expand on the world that you already love that someone else is doing, and try to write true to that. But for me, it's like I have one of the worlds that there's for a project I direct. There, where there's no day-night cycle, right? And for us, that is this thing that is, it's not big to the people in the world, right? They don't know any other way. But as writers, we all have to very carefully pay attention to, just idioms, even like since there's no day or night, right? Like the phrase "it dawned on me." We don't use that, and we have one person, we have a couple of people who go through and just comb through all of our stories and look for things like that. And but like that was something that we wanted in our world, was because of the way things worked, a day-night cycle didn't make sense, and it affected so much stuff. Where if you're like, oh, it's got to take place on the moon, it's like cool, like take those into effect. Now you have low gravity, you've got, probably don't have your own oxygen sources, and follow the web of what changes in the way you deal with life when you're in a different environment like that.
So that brings up a really good point, because I know in stories like Battlestar Galactica, they add like universe specific slang. So, the fracking, or in Firefly, they had this like Chinese influence. So they had a bunch of that slang work. Is that stuff that you like to write into your stories, that you like to, or that you think is useful to like come up with crazy slangs and sayings and sort of euphemisms, or like just say, hey, these are these cultural things that everybody say? Is that useful?
I think it can be very useful. I know that, it's like, I think that if, especially if you've got a culture that focuses on something, right? Like, if you've got a culture that focuses on just like fire, right? They're going to probably use a lot more heat-based idioms and stuff. And it's like, and I think like, the hardest thing when learning another language is not learning the words. It's the idioms and how to actually make sense of the things that people are saying locally, even if it's not another language. Just like English speaking languages or countries have so many different idioms that when people are talking, you're just like, I don't know what this means. um, but if you're in your world and you've set these idioms that line into all of the changes that you've been making obvious, now the changes just feel natural, right? Like if their language is built around these things, around the level of heat, or if they're built around the kind of art that people use, or if they've got some sort of supreme leader and there's a lot of idiom that has to do with his grace or whatever. These The way people talk really helps just make your world more real.
Okay. Well, so in that vein, because magic is something that happens in a lot of stories, and I think there's always this challenge of how do you build your magic system? Do you have to have wands and amulets and chanting books and stories and everything? Because whenever you see a lot of times when you see magic in anime, they have to do a thing. They have to do the magic dance to make it work. So how do you handle stuff like that in your stories, or how do you advise that a aspiring writer approaches a magical system?
So magic is tricky. I am of the camp that believes that all magic should, like, all effects should really have some sort of cost, right? Like with science, you get these changes, but like you had to either combine things, or you had to apply electricity to something, or there was a cost to get your effect. And I believe that magic should be that same way. And it can be something as simple as like I have to, like hit my magic just burns my calories. It's like I need to get into that restaurant and eat lots of food before I go into a big battle, because I'm going to burn that energy. And it can be, but like it can also be something like I need to do this ritual. And if that ritual gets messed up, either the magic will go haywire or not happen at all. But like if if your characters can just do magic with zero consequence, then that's where power levels get out of hand. Uh, I feel it makes it less believable, and it also makes it harder to shut down your characters if you need to. I know that there's been more than several times where I'm writing a character and they start getting a little bit too powerful, or uh, you know too confident in the way that everything works for them, and having weaknesses or a cost or something that somehow someone can interfere with, even if they're not more powerful. Like it's just like this thing, and it was like, oh, turns out you can't use your magic if magnets are around. I don't know, now anyone with a magnet can mess with your magic.
Yeah, so do you have advice on how to handle a character that is just gotten too powerful? Like you never like if you had to write, Dragon Ball Z Super Budokai Extra Mode plus plus Ultra with, god level Super Saiyans, like how would you approach something like that?
um Lots of ways to lots of ways, but I will fall back to break stuff, right? Like you know like if something's power level is to a point where they can do too much, make the things they can't do more important in the world. It's like, oh, I'm powerful. I'm like, okay, cool, but you can go fight that enemy, and you're gonna earn the animosity of people, and like they don't think that that person's an enemy, right? And so like breaking that down, or it's like a really lazy one is Superman kryptonite, right? I don't like that. But there can be things that get introduced that somehow draw the power off of the character or make their power pointless, or even it's like, again, a lazy one is the, oh, now they have amnesia and they don't know how to do these things. I think there's way better ways to handle that. You can, from that you can, it's like, I like things like, oh, now the character has lost a limb, and it's like they were using two hands to make all their conjurations or whatnot. Now they only have one arm. Now they have a new journey to go on. They've been set way the hell back. But it's like if they're all about power and whatnot, they're probably going to try to figure out how to regain power in their new set, which gives them a whole new journey, and gives other characters time to do stuff too, like and become their own level of importance.
So one of the common things I've seen with a way that a writer has solved a problem with two powerful characters, they just kill them, and that's kind of meh. Like, but character death is important, because it's a useful tool in writing. Like, how do you use a character's death or just death in general in your story, and like how do you suggest that people approach that and how they implement it into their own story so they're not just mowing through tons of mooks in their stories.
Yeah, character death. I also like. I am a firm believer that if I can get a character, if I can get a character I love dead, like it pulls at strings. I love it. But like, are you doing it wantonly? Because like that's not any good. And also, is death the best answer? Right? Like there are fates far worse than death, right? And so many different medias have shown us that. Like I just watched The Old Guard on Netflix, and they take an immortal and just lock them in an Iron Maiden and throw them in the ocean. Like that's way worse than death. But then like if the immortal is at the bottom of the ocean, they may become a problem later. And so like killing characters is great and important, and I think should not be done heavy-handedly. And but most importantly, I think that like I feel like every character death should feel earned. Like, and whether that's earned through they did something dumb, or the person who killed them or organization that killed them, really was on the ball and did their thing. I know that things die randomly, and I hate that in a story though. Like if the character is of any importance, and just because it's like it goes back to the role playing part, right? Like we've all lost characters, but like if you can lose your character in a meaningful way, then it turns from this thing that's kind of like, oh man, I had so much time invested in that character, to like, I earned this and this is a story and I will never forget it. And so for good guys and bad guys, I don't agree with with kind of like the superhero trope of we never actually kill anybody because we don't want to run out of villains and heroes that we have licensed, versus the Game of Thrones method of kill them all, like whatever, like no one is sacred.
So how do you get your inspiration for your worlds and building? Is it okay to just like, oh, we're setting this Firefly universe and I'm just going to make some tweaks and now it's my own special thing? Like, what is there any of that stuff, especially when you're writing novels, that you got to worry about people coming back and claiming that you're plagiarizing their work?
I so like I back to the spiderweb thing. Like I really do believe you can take just about any world that you find, and pick a few things that you're changing. The things that you are making your own, and then following that web of effect, right? And be it, Firefly, and, you say, okay, let's just say I'm playing in the Firefly world, or, universe, but, we, the government actually never got that big, right? Like, okay, well, without a big government like really dealing with this, how far do we push out? What went wrong because of that? What went right? And like, what are you focusing on now? It's like, the Firefly crew, where they were kind of all over the place, and they were, or they're being a little bit bad guys, but they're mostly being good guys, and they're helping stuff out. But they had to go out to the outer rims to do like a lot of the stuff that, the people that really needed help. Now suddenly, without that big government keeping that, maybe there's a lot more outlaw out there, and now you've got new factions that have built. Okay, well, with these new factions, like, who's important, what's going on, and suddenly, like, where you were focused on, this big central government, now you've ended up building out this area over here. Now the world, your whole story ended up just revolving around this, and uh, and now you're doing something that has very little to do with where it started. And I feel like when you just start following the paths of how things change, one, the world will start looking different, but two, you'll end up finding another focus usually. But it can also be on things like Earth, and just like, oh, what if, we never got electricity, like just never, like electricity just wasn't a thing, right? Okay, well, how would that have changed the inventions that we were doing? Like, how would that have changed like the way our technology works? Like, would we say, like, what would be the obvious path of, you hit that diesel era, and but we never got to just like start shrinking things down. And how did the world grow from there? And like, what industries come out of that? Like, like what kind of things are people trying to protect? What are our resources that matter, right? Where, like, right now, in our world, like, our resources that we care about are things like gold and platinum and cobalt, and all these things that are used in circuitry, and in copper, and all these things. But maybe if we never got past this more industrial stage, where there wasn't and there was no electricity, we don't care about things that are metals that are conductive all of a sudden. And so now, like, no one's digging up these resources. How does that affect things? Like, is there now a whole different, like, region that is built up because it hasn't been used for mining? And how does that grow out? And how, are they now an important region for a different cultural reason or whatever? And then it's just like, but it's that you just choose a couple of things to change, and it's like, maybe that thing that you've changed is, it's the Pokemon world, but no one knows about Pokemon except for the insiders. And now there is this secret thing, and how does that change?
That's really interesting, because like I get a sense when someone wants to start to write a story, they sometimes have a thought like, oh, I want to have these moments or these scenes, or I want to do this thing, or I want to get to this point. It's like, how do you keep that all together? Or is it just better to just like let your freak flag fly and just go wherever the story takes you? Like, like, is it important to have a plan of what you want to do?
I think that so, like, I am very much about letting characters drive the direction that they're going to go, and let the world drive the way it's going to go. So, like, I will have, like, I just started my third book in the series I'm working on, and like, I have like an 18-point plan of things that I know are going to happen because they happened in the other books, and I need to touch on them as I go through this. But I have no clue how they're going to get there. And like, it's like when I sat down and started writing, like, I knew the three characters, but I only knew anything about two of them. And so, like, I sat down and I interview my characters. So I interviewed this character and started learning about her, and realized that, like, she's just the living embodiment of id. And that very much affects the growth of the character that I'm focused on, because what he's got to do is deal with this person who is always around, who he enjoys, they are friends, but he's always having to do damage control. And so like I'm not even trying to figure out what said damage is going to be, right? Like I will start a scene, and if she walks in and she says whatever, horrible thing she might say, he gets to deal with the repercussions because she doesn't care. And so like I think that allowing that free form will allow your creative world to grow. But that's the way that I produce, and I know that there are a lot of people who outline everything and then just fill in the dots.
And so there's this saying from Cosmos that if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. I feel
Yes.
like writing stories, like you want to have two people meet in a cafe, you first must build the world that that cafe is within. So like how much depth do you need? Because like you could explain every little things and like pull out the mapping software and start drawing maps and make your city, or is it better like how much do you need to start writing or to start doing your story?
I don't think you need that much. Like if you're doing, like I'm actually writing, working on a scene right now that takes place in, and I just call it, I refer to it as it's just a tavern, right? We know that it takes place in a small village, and besides that, like I don't need to flesh out that village. There's nothing going on in it. But if they leave the tavern, now I'm good. It's like I'm gonna need to know what's going on outside there. Like is it dark and if it's nighttime? Like how much can they see? How is it lit? Like it's like, oh, they go outside and it turns out that there's a couple of torch lights, to help people get from building to building, but there's not much. Well, then I don't need to describe a whole lot besides that that's the level of technology they're using. Oh, they're using just a couple of torch lights, but I didn't need to come up with that until I left the building. But if they're in there, if they're sitting in that tavern, and what they're talking about is the conquest of the neighboring nation, um, then I should probably understand, what is the political setup between that place and their neighboring nation, or what is the geographical setup? If they're talking about marching thousands of, an army of thousands, well, I mean, then I'm going to guess that since they're having that conversation, there's not, a mountain range right between them, making that not very feasible, or maybe it is, and that's what they're talking about. So like, yeah, I mean, I would say in that situation, start with, like I am having a conversation in the room. What's the conversation about? Okay, what do I need to cover for that? And what do I need to know to make that conversation make sense and feel real? Where I've also got in our one of our other projects where we built out tons of stuff, and we regularly are like, okay, cool, like what if one of those things is rampaging? Cool, now we build a story around that, and that's because we built a bunch first. So it really depends on what are you trying to do with your story.
Awesome. Well, we are getting close to the end of our panel. We got about I think about 7 minutes left. Uh,
Okay.
so So if anyone has any additional questions, so please make sure you get them in the chat so we can get them answered for you. And we'll sort of keep going from there. I guess part of it, so do you find yourself sort of falling back on sort of historical tropes or particular like events like, oh, this is the thing that happens in every single one of my stories? Or do you try to like say, oh, I've already done a scene like that. I'm never going to do another scene like that again when you're trying to like write a book story?
I let the characters do what they're going to do, but I do try to not focus on the same thing over and over again. I like to see, like I'm big on just social character growth, and so it's like, oh, like I like what I hate is when a story is driven by two characters who never communicate. The only problems are ever because they don't communicate, or they hide things and they lie. Where if I have characters and it turns out that something went wrong because we failed to communicate, and one of them says, is like, where did this go wrong? And it was like, well, I mean, I knew all this stuff. And they're like, well, why didn't you share that with me? And then like I would hope that this character grows, right? Unless there's a reason this character can't, and in which case you may end up in the same a similar situation. But like I like my characters to grow and get better, and then move on to new problems that they have to solve. And so I guess if I had to say, do I go more on the don't use things over and over again versus fall back on them, I would go more towards the don't use things over and over again. But it's a sliding scale, and I'm like 2080. So yeah, that's
Okay. Yeah. So I got so I came up as I was sitting here a couple of lightning round questions. I'm going to ask you, would you rather write a story with this or that as the central focus? And I got just a couple of these.
will do.
So your preference, so just like, would you rather write a story with where everyone has swords or everyone has guns?
Swords. And because of that, like guns are a nice tool. Like they have their place. I've got stories that use them. But like there's something intimate about a sword, right? Like yes, someone can accidentally kill someone with a sword, but not as easily as you can accidentally kill someone with a gun. Like there's skills involved. I'm also like a fairly trained combatant, so like I write pretty detailed fights, and the detail that you can get in a fight with any sort of melee combat is, I think, way not, like I just think it's prettier than shooting guns. And so yeah.
So what about where your main character is a human or your main character is a monster slash alien slash whatever?
Oh, I'm so torn on both of those because I like them, but like I like humans in a world where there are all those other things, and seeing either why they are powerful somehow still, or why they're not. But I like the monster because like does the monster, like, do people know about these monsters? If they don't, why not? How does the world work with that? Or they do, okay, like have they risen to power? Have they not for some reason? Like I really like the dichotomy of both of those.
So do you like writing stories about spaceships or sea ships?
Oh, I would have to lean towards sea ships, because I like things to happen more on a planetary level than on an intergalactic level in my storytelling. Intergalactic, I feel like there's just so much to keep track of, and I keep track of a lot of things already.
Okay. So would you rather write a story that's super gory or super sexy?
Sexy, and if you can combine the two, I've written a couple of scenes that are not sexual in nature but are violent and sexy in nature, and and passionate, and that was actually more where I'd lead, is I want a scene that's passionate in whichever way it is, whether it's the violence of swords and knives where you're where you are up close and personal, uh, things like that.
Okay. And so superheroes or supervillains, who would you rather have your main character be?
Oh, I have main characters that are both. Um, I am actually more intrigued by villains, because I want to know why they're the good guy in their own story, and because I believe that any good villain is the good guy in their own story, even if they know they're bad. V for Vendetta is a great example of that, where he doesn't think he's a good person; he thinks he's doing a good thing.
Awesome. Well, we're just about at time for our panel, so I want to thank you for coming and talking about world building with our folks. Do you want to talk a little bit about how people can catch up with you after the event, or they want to follow you on your socials or whatever it is that you do, and just give us your pluggables?
Yeah. So feel free to DM me on Discord. If you find me in the Kumo Discord in there. I'm Will Carson, panelist. But also you can follow me on Facebook. I'm Guarman or at Guarman. Will Carson, I'm the one that's on fire because I also am a stunt performer. And then I actually have 2 Patreons I'm involved in, and it's Waking of the Gods, which is my series about vampires and gods and all that stuff. And then we also have the Aegis of the Elements up there, and that is a series that is all about that contained world I was talking about, that where we built everything up from scratch. So thank you all for joining me, and had a great time. And if you have any follow-up questions afterwards, feel free to send them my way.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Will. And I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of KomoriCon. So have a good one.
Later.
Bye. ああ広は